Welcome to the Purple Positivity Podcast for March the 19th, 2018. I am your host, the amazingly adorable and awesomely awkward Rebecca Thistle, podcasting to you live-ish from my kitchen/dining room table in my apartment, which I call Jeffrey Thistlework. Yay! So, if this were a professional podcast, and if I were a techno-savvy audio editing wizardy podcaster, I would have an audio clip of this, but it's not, I'm not, so I don't. So let's do this. Boom! Okay. Back in the early noughties, there was a sitcom on the now defunct WB called Reba, starring Reba McEntire, obviously. And I guess this was actually in season 5 that this took place. Reba was having a conversation on the show with her son-in-law Van about a real estate investment, and she was expressing a lot of doubt and worry about the legitimacy of it, and I can't control the situation, basically, and so I'm afraid of it, and I'm going to argue with you because that's the thing you do when you're afraid. So Van stops her at some point. He says, "Mrs. H, I got one word for you. Let it go." And Reba says, "Van, that's 3 words." Van says, "Not the way I say it. Let it go." So that's the title of this show, but you should have already known that, but that's where it comes from. So before I go get into this, I have to make this disclaimer because that's what I do. I'm not perfect. I know, shocking, right? I'm not perfect. When I get on this show and I talk about ideas that I have, techniques that I use, philosophies and perspectives and stuff like that, that's me talking and hoping that my words reach someone who needs to hear them. If I'm flawed. Like, I can probably get a whole room full, nay, a platoon, nay, an army of people who would be happy to come on this show and tell you in exquisite detail how I'm not perfect, and all of them would be right. Well, not all of them, but most of them would be right. Well, okay, all of them would be right to some degree, but most of them would be right to a greater degree. Anyways, the point is, I'm not perfect. I'm not trying to get up on a high horse. I'm not trying to get preachy. I'm not trying to say, hey, do what I do because I'm so perfect and awesome, and my life is so together. My life is not together. I'm getting it together. And part of my process of getting it together is talking about it on this podcast. So this podcast is not about being perfect. This podcast is about sharing my imperfections with an imperfect world and trying to use my imperfections not only to better myself, but to help other people better themselves as well. Okay? So are we clear? I'm not preaching. I'm not perfect. Because what I'm about to tell you, I figured this out, 2 years ago? A year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. And yet, somehow, I'm struggling yet again to do this. I'll get into that after I tell you this. Okay, so, about 3.5 years ago, I left an abusive situation. With my son was 9 months old at the time, and we went into a domestic violence shelter, and that's a whole other story for a whole other show. But what you need to know about that was one of the people in that abusive situation was a driver for the city bus service. And I consequently did not want to ride the buses after I left that situation, I was like, I don't want anything to do with her ever again. No. And and so I didn't ride the buses for 18 months. The very thought of it would give me a panic attack. And that's going to sound so silly and so stupid. Like, come on, Becca, if that's your only form of transportation, get over it, right? And I would talk about it with my therapist. I would talk about it with my friends. And the problem wasn't that I was afraid of her or the things she would say. I was afraid of facing her because I didn't want to deal with the anger and the memories and the pain and then the inevitable nightmares that would follow because of what she did to me. Because, like, I knew, objectively I knew that, you know, if I got on a bus and she was driving it, if she wanted to sit and talk shit, I could report her and get her fired. Objectively, I knew that. Emotionally, I didn't want to hear her voice. I didn't want to hear her. I didn't want to get on a bus that she was driving and hear her voice announcing the stops. I didn't want to get on a bus that she wasn't driving and then hear her over the radio, either dispatching or talking to the dispatcher while she's driving. I didn't want to do that. I did not, because it caused me so much anger and pain and resentment. So for 18 months, I didn't ride the bus. And finally one day, my mom had enough. And she said, Becca, you're getting over it. So she took a long lunch one day at work, drove to my house, parked her car in my driveway, and the two of us walked to the bus stop. We rode the bus to the station, transferred to another bus, and we went to my school. Then my mom, realizing how crappy the buses actually were, called for a ride so she could go get her car. Oh, bless her. But because she did this for me, it made it so that I went, okay, I can ride the buses. So the next day, I get up and I get myself and my son ready. My son was 2 years old at the time. And we ride the bus to the station. And we get to the station, and I step up onto a bus, and it's driven by the person that abused me. The one person I didn't want to see. And I shut down. And so it wasn't until the bus had already left the station that I realized which route it was, and it wasn't the route I wanted to be on. And I just shut down. And this driver is sitting here trying to be all friendly, like act like nothing had happened, and yada yada yada. And I excuse me, that's a whole other story that I don't have time to get into. But I just sat there, stoic, didn't say anything. But I was seething in anger, and it hurt so much. And like I said, my son was about 2 years old at the time, and so I'm like holding on to him for dear life, because this is the one part of my world that keeps me anchored in reality. I mean, even to this day, but especially in that moment. And I feel guilty saying that, because that's not his job. That's not his job. My son did not come into this world with a job title. And I don't want him to feel that way. But at that moment, he saved my life in a lot of ways. So thankfully I knew the route that I was on. Like, I knew which route. It was the wrong route, but I knew where the route went. And so I got off at a reasonable stop and called for a ride and got my son to daycare. And but I had this epiphany once I got off the bus, I lived. I have all the power. And I went, yay, me. And I was very proud. And so I started riding the buses again. And I stopped being scared of it. And 6 months go by, and I didn't see this bus driver again at all. Until my son switched daycares. And then the bus that went by his daycare every morning was driven by her. And it all slammed back. Like, I mean, it's really hard to explain. It didn't deter me from riding the buses. It made it harder for me to get myself out of the house in the morning. I would cry every single morning before I left the house to go to the bus stop because I didn't want to do it, but I knew I had to. And and so there had been some strength that was built up in between the first and the next time I saw her. But still, every time I saw her, I'd get up on that bus, and she'd act like everything was fine, yada, yada, yada. And then I'd get off at my stop, walk my son over to his daycare, dick around for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes, something like that, and then walk to another bus stop, get back on the bus, and ride it back to the station, transfer, do whatever else I had to do for the day. So I had to see this person twice a day and hear her voice and experience that anger and that pain, and it made life so difficult for me. I'd cry before I left the house. I'd cry after dropping my son off because I had to hold it together long enough to drop him off at daycare, but I'd cry after I dropped him off. I'd just sit there crying for like 30 minutes, just mad at myself for being angry, for holding on to the past. And so I went to talk to somebody that I trusted about this. And I said, I can't stop taking my son to daycare because he needs the social interaction. I need the break. I can't stop taking him. And the only way to get him there is to ride this bus. I'm in pain every single day. How do I make myself not be in pain? This person said, forgive. Forgive is a less secular way of saying let it go. Okay? Let's define forgiveness here. Forgiveness is not about saying, you know what? It's all good, and you just hold hands and tra-la-la-la-la into the sunset. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is about saying, what you did was wrong, but I'm not going to let it. No, not but, because but denotes like ignore what I just said. What you did was wrong, and I'm not going to let it affect me. I am not going to be bound to you in any way that I do not want to be bound to you. So if that involves continuing a relationship with someone,